The Arabian Sea, in the early hours of a Wednesday morning, carries no warning of what is coming. The surface is dark and long-swelled from the southwest monsoon residue, the sky above it clear enough that the stars are present in their full density from horizon to horizon, and the only lights visible from the bridge of the USS Dwight Eisenhower are the navigation lights of commercial traffic on the northbound lane 12 miles to the east, and the position lights of the Combat Air Patrol holding its orbit at altitude to the northwest. The Eisenhower has been operating in the central Arabian Sea for 17 days. Her crew is in the operational rhythm that extended carrier deployments produce. The rhythm where the days compress into a continuous cycle of launches and recoveries and watches and maintenance that makes any specific day difficult to distinguish from the one before it. The night of this specific Wednesday had been unremarkable until 2:47 a.m., when the infrared satellite network detected a launch signature from a fixed position on the Iranian coast that had been on the targeting watch list for 11 months, and that the satellite's algorithms processed, formatted, and transmitted to every node in the Pacific and Central Command networks in the 4 seconds before the launch signature had fully developed into a visible plume. The warning reached the USS Hue City at 2:47 a.m. and 40 seconds. The Hue City was a Ticonderoga-class cruiser operating 22 nautical miles ahead of the Eisenhower on the formation's most likely threat axis, a positioning that the strike group's anti-air warfare coordinator had recommended and the Admiral had approved on the first day of operations in this area. 22 nautical miles ahead meant the Hue City was the formation's furthest forward sensor and weapons node. It also meant that the Hue City was, relative to a missile launched from the Iranian coast toward the carrier's positioned in a geometry that the anti-air warfare coordinator had spent 11 days calculating and refining against the specific trajectory envelopes that ballistic missiles launched from the identified coastal facility would follow. The geometry was not accidental. The Hue City was exactly where she needed to be for the engagement that had just become real. The Hue City's Combat Information Center went from its nighttime watch posture to full action stations in a transition that the crew's readiness drills had reduced to a sequence measured in seconds rather than minutes. The watch team had been at a heightened posture since the previous evening, when a signals intelligence update had indicated elevated activity at the coastal launch facility that the satellite watch list had been monitoring. The heightened posture had not produced the kind of certainty that would justify full action stations as a sustained condition. But it had produced the kind of alert that ensured the personnel most critical to an intercept engagement were sleeping in their sea cabins adjacent to the CIC rather than in the berthing spaces further into the ship's interior. When the satellite warning arrived, the additional seconds that proximity saved were not nothing. They were the margin between an engagement begun at maximum readiness and an engagement begun at adequate readiness. And maximum and adequate were not the same thing at 2:47 a.m. with a ballistic missile already above the atmosphere. The commanding officer of the Hue City reached the CIC at 2:48 a.m. and 15 seconds. His SPY-1 radar had acquired the threat track at 2:47 a.m. and 55 seconds, 15 seconds after the satellite warning had arrived and as the missile was completing its boost phase and transitioning to mid-course flight. The track was precise. The trajectory solution that the engagement software was computing updated with every radar refresh, each update narrowing the uncertainty bands around the missile's predicted apogee, its mid-course trajectory, and, most critically, its terminal phase entry point and projected impact coordinates. The impact coordinates were updating toward a solution that the combat systems officer reported to the commanding officer at 2:48 a.m. and 40 seconds. The report used coordinates that the commanding officer did not need to look up on a chart. The coordinates were within 4 nautical miles of the Eisenhower's current position. The solution was still updating. The uncertainty band was still narrowing. The direction of the narrowing was not in the Eisenhower's favor. The engagement authorization framework for this specific threat category had been reviewed, exercised, and signed by everyone in the relevant chain before the Eisenhower strike group had entered this operating area. The framework existed precisely because a ballistic missile's flight time did not accommodate the kind of deliberative authorization process that other threat categories permitted. The commanding officer transmitted his engagement notification to the Admiral's CIC aboard the Eisenhower at 2:48 a.m. and 50 seconds. He did not wait for a response before directing his combat systems officer to proceed. The framework authorized him to proceed. The timeline required him to proceed. The notification was simultaneous with the proceed directive, not sequential to it. These were the same action at the same moment. 2 keystrokes on 2 different consoles executed by 2 different operators within the same second. The SM-6 interceptors left the Hue City's vertical launch system at 2:49 a.m. and 22 seconds. 2 missiles launched in a salvo sequence whose interval had been computed by the engagement software to optimize the probability of intercept, given the uncertainty that remained in the trajectory solution at the moment of launch. The first missile's trajectory was computed against the trajectory solution's central estimate. The second missile's trajectory was computed against the solution's eastern bias case. The trajectory the software assessed as most likely if the missile's terminal guidance system was executing a last phase maneuver. The SM-6 was not designed purely for ballistic missile defense. Its design included the aerodynamic agility in the terminal phase to address targets that were maneuvering, and the specific variant aboard the Hue City had been loaded in anticipation of exactly this threat category when the strike group's weapons loadout had been reviewed 11 days earlier. The load decision had been made by the weapons officer in coordination with the strike group's intelligence picture, which had included the coastal facility's known missile inventory and the assessed maneuvering capability of the specific systems that inventory contained. The load decision had been correct. The missile in the air was the one the weapons officer's assessment had described. The Hue City's CIC tracked both interceptors from the moment of launch. The primary display showed the threat track, the 2 interceptor tracks, and the continuously updating geometry of where all 3 would be at every point in the engagement timeline. The room's lighting was the red of action stations. The smell was recycled air, and the particular electrical note that the SPY-1 radar's power systems produced at full operational load, a smell that every crew member in the CIC had associated with the highest intensity of their professional life since the first time they had stood a watch at full combat power. Nobody in the room was looking at anything except their assigned display. The radar officer's voice was the only human sound in the room beyond the mechanical background of the ship's systems, and his voice carried the track updates in the cadence of a professional who has been trained to measure the weight of what he is saying by the effect of that weight on the people who need to hear it clearly. His cadence was even. His voice did not carry more weight than the information required. The room received the information and processed it, and did not add to it. At 2:51 a.m. and 7 seconds, the radar officer's cadence changed by exactly 1 syllable. He reported the first interceptor's miss. The engagement geometry had been close. The trajectory solution at launch had been computed against the best available data, and the best available data had contained an uncertainty that the missile's actual terminal behavior had placed outside the first interceptor's engagement envelope. The miss was within the predicted uncertainty band. It was, in the professional language of the combat systems officer's subsequent engagement review, an expected outcome of engaging a maneuvering target at the solution accuracy available at time of launch. Expected did not mean comfortable. In the CIC of the Hue City at 2:51 a.m., the first interceptor's miss was processed by every person in the room in the 4 seconds between the radar officer's report and the second interceptor's terminal phase entry, and it was processed with the specific quality of focus that the knowledge of what was still in the air and what was still available to address it produces in people who understand that their job is to process and act and not to feel, at least not yet. The second interceptor entered its terminal phase at 2:51 a.m. and 11 seconds. The SM-6's terminal guidance system acquired the threat track on its own seeker and began the final approach geometry that the interceptor's aerodynamic control surfaces were designed to execute against a maneuvering ballistic target. The seeker had the target. The geometry was within the engagement envelope. The combat systems officer reported this to the commanding officer in 2 words. The commanding officer acknowledged in 1. The intercept occurred at 2:51 a.m. and 31 seconds. The radar officer's report of the intercept was 6 words. The CIC received those 6 words in the specific silence that follows a high-stakes outcome when the outcome is the one that was required. The silence lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then, the combat systems officer began the post-intercept assessment sequence. The threat track had fragmented. The radar was resolving the debris field. The debris trajectories were being computed. The largest fragment was on a trajectory that the navigation team assessed as impacting the ocean surface approximately 80 nautical miles northeast of the Eisenhower. Not on the Eisenhower. Not in the Eisenhower's operating area. In empty ocean. The intercept had occurred at a point in the missile's trajectory that maximized the debris dispersion distance from the carrier. The geometry had been designed for exactly this. The commanding officer of the Hue City transmitted his post-intercept report to the Eisenhower's CIC at 2:52 a.m. The report was factual, sequential, and complete. It described the engagement from satellite warning to debris field resolution in the language that engagement reports use, and it ended with the assessment that the threat had been addressed and that no additional ballistic missile signatures had been detected from the coastal facility in the period following the launch. No additional signatures as of 2:52 a.m. The period following the launch was still short. Additional launches from the same facility could not be ruled out. The commanding officer's report made this explicit in its final sentence. The admiral had been in the Eisenhower's CIC from 2:48 a.m. onward. He had received the Hue City's engagement notification, had watched the engagement on his own display, and had been processing the first interceptor's miss in the 31 seconds between that report and the second interceptor's confirmation with the particular quality of command attention that exists when an outcome is still unresolved and the commander's role is to hold the space for the operators to finish their work. When the intercept confirmation arrived, the admiral had already moved to the next problem. The next problem had been building since 2:47 a.m. and 40 seconds, and its name was the facility that had launched the missile. The targeting package for the coastal launch facility had been maintained by the Eisenhower Strike Planning Cell for 11 months, updated weekly with any new collection that refined the aim points, the weapon configurations, or the collateral effect assessments. The package was current. It had been reviewed and validated by the Strike Planning Cell's duty officer at the beginning of the evening watch, 6 hours before the launch, as part of the standard package maintenance cycle. The Strike Planning Cell did not know, at the time of that review, that the package would be needed within 6 hours. They maintained it as though it would be needed at any moment, because that was what maintaining a targeting package correctly required. The strike authorization request reached the relevant command authority at 2:54 a.m. The command authority had been tracking the engagement through the same reporting architecture that had reached the Eisenhower and the Hue City, and the strike authorization request arrived in a channel that had been clear and waiting since 2:47 a.m. The authorization came back at 2:59 a.m., 5 minutes and change from intercept confirmation to strike authorization. The Strike Planning Cell had used those 5 minutes to format the mission brief, assign the aircraft, and verify the ordnance load on the 2 A-18F crews that had been placed on standby alert at 2:48 a.m., the moment the engagement notification had gone out. The brief was complete when the authorization arrived. The mission was ready to launch before the authorization landed. The 2 FA-18Fs launched from the Eisenhower's flight deck at 3:04 a.m. The night launch sequence proceeded with the organized precision that the carrier's flight deck crew executed regardless of the hour. The physical process of moving aircraft from hangar to flight deck to catapult to air, operating with the same controlled urgency at 3:04 a.m. as it did at noon. The flight deck was dark except for the operational lighting that the launch sequence required. The catapult officers moved in the red and white pattern of their signal wands. The aircraft crews ran their final checks. The catapults fired. The FA-18Fs cleared the bow and climbed into the darkness above the Arabian Sea, turning northwest toward a coastal position that their targeting systems had loaded before they left the deck. The approach to the target area took 38 minutes at the airspeed the mission planning specified. The approach route had been designed against the air defense threat overlay that the targeting package contained, routing the aircraft through a coastal approach corridor whose radar coverage gaps the collection architecture had identified, and whose terrain masking the approach altitude exploited. The electronic warfare officer in the lead aircraft was monitoring the radar warning receiver throughout the approach. The receiver showed radar emissions from the coastal air defense network at bearings and ranges consistent with the threat overlay. None of the emissions were in track mode. None were in guidance mode. The emissions were surveillance. The aircraft were not being tracked. The terrain masking was performing as designed. At 3:40 a.m., the lead aircraft's targeting system placed the coastal facility's primary aim points in the center of its targeting display. The facility was visible in the targeting pod's infrared imagery, its surface structures resolved against the dark coastal terrain by the thermal differential between the facility's operational infrastructure and the surrounding ground. The facility was active. Its power generation was visible as a thermal signature in the imagery. Whether it was active because its crew was preparing a second launch or because its crew was monitoring the outcome of the first, the targeting pod did not distinguish. The facility was the mission's objective, and the facility was present and resolved and in the engagement solution. The weapons systems officer in the lead aircraft transmitted the final targeting confirmation to Eisenhower at 3:40 a.m. and 30 seconds. The confirmation was acknowledged. The mission was authorized to proceed at 3:40 a.m. and 45 seconds. The weapons systems officer received the authorization on the data link and directed the lead pilot to the weapon employment point. The first pair of precision-guided munitions left the lead aircraft at 3:42 a.m. from a standoff range that kept the aircraft in the terrain, masking corridor for the entirety of the weapon run. The munitions ran their terminal guidance sequences against the aim points the targeting package had specified, adjusting their trajectories in the final seconds of flight with the precision that the guidance system's GPS inertial integration provided. They reached the facility at 3:43 a.m. and 40 seconds. The targeting pod recorded the impacts in its infrared imagery. The primary launch infrastructure took the first and second impacts. The facility's power generation signature, which had been visible in the thermal imagery since the aircraft reached the target area, changed at 3:43 a.m. and 44 seconds. Changed in the specific way that a thermal signature changes when the system producing it is no longer producing it. The second aircraft employed against the facility's secondary infrastructure at 3:44 a.m. The aim points included the access roads connecting the facility to the surrounding area, the communications antenna infrastructure visible on the facility's perimeter, and the vehicle staging area that the targeting package had identified as the primary reconstitution logistics point. 4 additional munitions. 4 additional impacts across a 9-second window. The targeting pod on the second aircraft recorded the same facility that the lead aircraft's pod had shown 2 minutes earlier, and showed a facility whose surface infrastructure had changed from the profile that 11 months of collection had characterized as operational. The weapons systems officer did not use the word destroyed. The report he transmitted at 3:45 a.m. used the word suppressed and described the specific elements that had been impacted and the observable changes in the facility's thermal and structural profile. Suppressed and the description that followed it were sufficient. The strike planning cell would conduct the formal battle damage assessment from the imagery packages both aircraft carried when they recovered. The 2 FA-18Fs turned southeast at 3:45 a.m. and 30 seconds on the return heading to the Eisenhower. The radar warning receiver in the lead aircraft remained consistent with the surveillance emissions it had shown throughout the approach. No tracking mode transitions. No guidance mode activations. The Coastal Air Defense Network had not resolved the aircraft's presence in its coverage area during the approach or the employment. The masking corridor had held through the employment and was holding through the egress. The aircraft climbed to their recovery altitude on the outbound leg and increased to the speed that the Eisenhower's recovery cycle required. The Hue City had maintained her operating position throughout the strike package's transit and employment. Her SPY-1 radar had been in continuous surveillance mode since the Intercept engagement, watching the coastal area for any additional launch signatures. No additional launches had been detected. The facility's emissions, which the Hue City's electronic warfare suite had been monitoring as a secondary product of its post-intercept surveillance cycle, had reduced at 3:43 a.m. in a pattern consistent with the strike package's reported impacts. By 3:46 a.m., the facility's previously active emission signature was absent from the electronic warfare suite's display. The electronic warfare officer noted this in his post-engagement report with the specificity the report format required, and added a notation that the absence was consistent with the strike package's battle damage assessment imagery pending formal review. The Eisenhower's flight deck received the 2 FA-18Fs at 4:23 a.m. The recovery was conducted in darkness with the standard night recovery protocols, the aircraft catching the 3-wire in the sequence that the landing signal officers had directed from their platform on the deck's edge. The aircraft were cleared from the landing area, checked, and moved to their parking positions while the flight deck crew began the post-recovery cycle that would have them at launch readiness for the next mission within the hour. The Eisenhower resumed her standard operating pattern at 4:45 a.m. The C AP aircraft that had been airborne during the engagement returned to their assigned orbits. The watch rotations resumed their standard cycle. The Hue City returned to her forward position in the formation, her combat systems at the readiness state that had been in place since 2:47 a.m., and that would remain in place for the duration of the current operational period. The replenishment accounting for the 2 SM-6 interceptors she had employed was submitted to the logistics coordinator at 5 a.m. Replenishment would be scheduled. The weapons had performed the function they existed to perform. The accounting was the administrative recognition of that function. At 6:15 a.m., the collection architecture produced the first post-strike imagery of the coastal facility. The imagery was processed, and a preliminary battle damage assessment was transmitted to the strike planning cell and to the Admiral at 6:47 a.m. The assessment used the word suppressed for the primary launch infrastructure and the word degraded for the secondary elements. It assessed the facility's ability to conduct additional ballistic missile launches within the current operational period as significantly reduced. Significantly reduced was not eliminated. The facility existed within a broader infrastructure, and that infrastructure had redundancies. What the assessment described was the current facility's current capability, not the network's long-term capability. The strike planning cell noted this distinction in their own summary and updated the targeting package accordingly. The Arabian Sea received the pre-dawn watch transition at 5:30 a.m. with the same indifference that it brought to every watch transition in every sea state in every season of the year. The surface moved. The commercial traffic held its lanes. The Eisenhower's formation held its operating area. The Hue City sat 22 nautical miles ahead in the geometry that the anti-air warfare coordinator had placed her in 11 days earlier. The geometry had been correct. The positioning had produced the outcome that the positioning had been designed to produce. The Eisenhower had continued her operations. The missile that had been intended to reach her had reached the ocean surface 80 nautical miles away and changed nothing about the carrier's operational posture except the weapons inventory of the cruiser that had stopped it. 22 nautical miles of forward positioning. 2 SM-6 interceptors launched at 2:49 a.m. One missile missed. One missile connected at 2:51 a.m. and 31 seconds. 38 minutes to target. 6 precision-guided munitions. 1 coastal launch facility suppressed. 0 damage to the Eisenhower or any strike group asset. The formation continued. What the formation's position in the Arabian Sea represents is not simply the presence of a carrier and her escorts in a body of water. It represents the accumulated precision of every decision that placed each asset exactly where the engagement required it to be. Maintained at readiness by people who understood that the geometry had to be right before the threat was real. Because after the threat is real, the geometry is fixed, and only the preparation determines the outcome. On this morning, the geometry was right. The preparation was complete. The outcome followed. The carrier operates where the mission requires, because the force that operates it has spent the time before the mission ensuring that when the mission demands everything, everything is ready. The Eisenhower moved south. The watch continued. The Arabian Sea held its silence. The debris field northeast of the formation settled into the ocean floor and became part of it, and the ocean did not distinguish it from anything else it had received. The carrier did not stop.